Hello and welcome to this Noble Systems webinar. Today we will be covering the topic of the contact centre and self-service, avoiding the pitfalls. We'll be given a brief outline of the agenda in a couple of minutes of what we're going to discuss over the next 45 minutes. But firstly, just by way of introductions, my name is Chris Brown, Sales Account Manager at Noble Systems. I'll be your host today, and I'm joined by Steve Siddle, who is our contact centre specialist, who will be our primary speaker today. I'm aware that there's some of you who will be familiar with Noble Systems, but for those who aren't, Noble Systems are a leading provider of fully blended contact center communications and technology for a variety of clients across a wealth of different industries, including debt collections, telemarketing, outsourcing, and customer services in both the public and private sectors. I know we've got a wide variety of companies represented on the call today, so hopefully there'll be some good takeaways for each and every one of you from the webinar today. So just by way of an outline of the agenda of what we're going to discuss today, you'll be able to see on your screens now just a couple of key points that we're going to go over. There will be a question and answers section at the end, where we'll endeavour to answer any questions that you put forward to us, or we'll try to cover them throughout the webinar. So we're going to try and keep it as interactive as possible, and we'd like to get your opinions on self-service as we go along. So we're going to do a number of polls as we go through the webinar. You'll notice you've got a poll answer section that'll come up for you. So we're going to kick off by just saying, are you using any form of self-service at the moment in your contact centre? So just a simple yes or no question and answer. So if you just click on your screen there, and then we can just I suppose see what the overwhelming consensus is on that one. Okay, so that's interesting. There's quite a number of you who aren't using self-service at the moment, so hopefully there should be some quite good takeaways in terms of direction if you're implementing this, and for those who do use it at the moment, I suppose just a good sanity check for you as well. So probably quite a good time to hand over to our lead speaker today, so Steve Siddle. I'll pass you over now.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Chris said, my name is Steve Siddle. I work as a contact centre specialist for Noble Systems. The slide you're looking at the moment, I think generally these days that most businesses have accepted the benefits of self-service, and they're quite clear in the contact centre at the moment. So you can see from the diagram the potential benefits, such as the reducing cost as you go from typically the most expensive end of the spectrum, which is serving via a live contact centre agent, down through live chat and email, and then to self-service. So typically the self-service cost will be a fraction of the contact centre agent cost. And if you think about the channels that are sort of commonly available these days, you've got IVR and speech. So that's basically either via DTMF using the numbers on your phone, or actual speech-enabled IVRs. Then you've got the web channel, that's generally fairly commonly used these days as well. And then sort of moving into sort of more of the later developments in terms of utilising SMS or smartphone applications to self-serve. And then looking at, some of the self-service transactions, so you might serve, FAQs, customer self-help applications, interactive support for IT issues. And then you've got sort of for customers that are currently one of yours, where you might want to check your order progress, your delivery progress. You might want to check flight details, or you might actually want to, perhaps put a credit increase on a card you have. And then you've got the sort of more transactional-based things, such as online shopping and actual making payments on accounts that you've got or for your online shopping purpose.
Okay, so we're just going to perform another poll now for you. So I know that there's a lot of you who weren't using self-service channels, but for those of you who were, what self-service channels are you using at the moment? So you'll see a couple of options come up on your screen now. So are you using web channels, IVR, DTMF and speech? mobile, so SMS and smartphone apps, or other if relevant. So that should come up on your screen now. So if you could just fill in those options, and we'll see what the most overwhelming was one of those.
Okay, so that's quite interesting. The majority of people are sort of saying that they're using web, but there's a sort of a split between IVR and mobile self-service applications, so that's quite interesting. So I think the first thing I like to sort of talk about when I'm talking about self-service is what I think is quite important is the customer expectations. So what I mean by that is what is a person looking for from self-service? So in my opinion, I think one of the things you've got to get is it's got to be easy to use. So people like things to be easy. You've got to make things easy for them if you want them to utilise your self-service channels that you're offering. Then I think people look for availability. So that's, can I use this 24/7, any day of the year? Can I use it on a public holiday? Can I use it at weekends? And then convenience. So this is, not having to actually travel to a store to make a purchase, and the ability to access from anywhere. You might not be at home, you might be in the car, even sometimes not having to speak with a person is an element of convenience for some people. For example, some customers don't want to converse with a live agent. This can sometimes be purely a preference, but it sometimes might indicate a dislike of the agent route, such as, if, for example, in your contact centre there is a drive to upsell, if you place a self-service channel in there, the customer might then use that to avoid that upsell. And it's important to be aware of this potential and consider when thinking about offering self-service options. Then I think the next element is it's got to offer some sort of saving. So is there any benefit or financial incentive for using the channel? Are you going to pass on some of the savings to encourage take-up? And also there's a time element of this as well. Is it going to save the customer time? And then probably the most important element is it's got to work. So what is the customer's end result? So the customer's objective has got to be achieved both in the short term and the long term. And worthwhile bearing in mind that when a self-service channel doesn't work, even though the issue might not actually be down to a failure in your design or a system, it may actually be working as designed, but it fails due to maybe the customer making an error. A customer will probably not see this as their fault, as they'll associate the failure to the route that they've actually used to service, and then they might change their future behaviour.
And I think, Steve, it's probably a good chance to just give an example of this. There's actually one of our customers who primarily operates in the healthcare industry, and this is an example of where it does work, perhaps. And the kind of calls that they deal with are quite sort of sensitive, I suppose. It's to do with people's health, and potentially, I suppose, quite embarrassing for the customer on the end of the line, disclosing those details to an unknown agent on the other end of the phone who perhaps they've never met before. So a good, I suppose, example where self-service can be beneficial for both the company as well as the customer, as it gives that level of discretion, really.
Thanks, Chris. So just on the next slide, I'm just going to talk a little bit about, to help illustrate the points I've just covered. So an actual real-life example from a recent experience of self-service I had. So it was my son's birthday quite recently, and he wanted to go with his friends to see the new Lego movie, which I can recommend if anyone's looking for something to go and see. As it was the opening weekend, I knew it was going to be busy, so I wanted to ensure I got the tickets for everyone. Now, as it was the evening when he asked if he could go, although the cinema was open, I didn't want to get in the car and travel to the cinema to pick up the tickets. So I made plans to sort of do it the next morning whilst I was at work, using the cinema's self-service website to book tickets. And I was already registered for this site, so that would be fairly straightforward for me. So in the morning I booked the tickets as planned, but this particular cinema doesn't offer the ability to reserve specific seats. Now that's obviously quite critical in this particular scenario, planned to do was to get to the cinema to collect the tickets around 30 minutes or so before the show time, because that should have given plenty of time to get seated. So going back to the points of expectations again, so was it easy to use? So yeah, website was easy to use, it was clear, I'd used it before, and as I already had a registered account, this was a service that they offered on this particular cinema website, it made it very, very easy for me. So was it available? So yeah, it was available in the morning when the cinema was closed, so that worked for me. Was it convenient? So yeah, didn't want to have to travel to the cinema to pick up the tickets, so pretty convenient for me. Did it offer any savings? Well, I'm not sure. So, you know, it gave me some savings in relation to time, as I didn't have to travel to the site. And it also, I was registered, so when you register with this particular company, you actually get a discount on your tickets. And it worked. So yeah, I was able to book my tickets and successfully and get confirmation of my purchase to both my phone and via email. But is actually that the end of the self-service transaction? So I'll continue this little story later. Okay, so next thing to sort of talk about is the key elements of self-service that I think are important. So first of all, I think one of the most important things is you've got to choose the right transactions. So this might be different from business to business in terms of what you're actually able to offer, so self-service as an option for, and then you've got to design the application to deliver that transaction correctly in terms of functionality and flow. And then systems. System capabilities are directly linked to both the self-service options you're going to be able to offer and the ongoing performance of the self-service applications. And then people. So clearly your customers are really critical to the whole process, as they've got to decide to use this service. You've got to understand them and their expectations to effectively self-serve them. You know, for example, if you've got a high proportion of older customers, surveys have shown that surveys have shown that older customers are less likely to take up self-service channels, so consider that. And also, you know, maybe older customers have a higher proportion of non-DTMF compatible phones, so that's worthwhile considering if you're offering an IVR self-service. And then internal staff, even though that they might appear to be detached from the self-service process, they're critically important to the process, in my opinion. And I'll cover this point a bit later. So then, measuring results. So this is the ability to measure the successful transactions against the goals of the self-service strategy. And then you've got to understand the reasons why any specific customer wasn't able to use the self-service channel by using reporting routes. You've got to be able to do that at individual failure points within the transaction flow of the self-service.
And just actually on that, Steve, with regards to measuring results, considering many of the self-service channels are what we regard as new technologies rather than your traditional voice channels, what sort of challenges do companies face, I suppose, primarily around effective benchmarking?
Well, I think firstly it's going to be different for each business, as the key elements that I've just talked about are going to differ, such as systems are going to be different, the customers will be different, and probably the processes to achieve the results are different. So don't concern yourselves too much with benchmarking against other businesses, because I'd expect different take-up and success rates initially. However, make sure that the results you're aiming for will work for you in what you've defined in the business case for your self-service, and it's based upon what you need to achieve against your success criteria, such as, you know, to get your return on investment or your customer satisfaction rates or service levels.
Okay, so we've just got another poll for you here. So you should be able to see it on screen in a second, but which types of services are you interested in providing a self-service option for? So by this we mean which business functions would you look to self-serve for? So is that Q&A, so supporting a knowledge base? This could be a sort of FAQs page on the website. Things like account servicing, so order tracking, checking in balance, online banking, etc. And transactional, so the actual purchase transaction between the customer and the company, or indeed other, if you've got any other considerations.
Okay, so interesting breakdown there. So we've actually got another, so might be interesting finding out what that is later. So I think the next thing I'm going to talk about is common mistakes. So this is from my experience in rolling out a variety of self-service transactions in a variety of businesses, and this is what I've seen sometimes both from internally and also seen utilising self-service transactions from as a customer I've seen as common mistakes. So initially I think the first one tends to be purely financial considerations. So often businesses will make a judgment purely from a cost benefit on the transaction cost to serve, as we looked at earlier in the presentation, compared with a more expensive alternative. And I think sometimes the customer perspective is forgotten in terms of ease of use and other impacts such as interaction opportunity with a customer. So, if you take the example of cash machines, so cash machines, they're fully accepted nowadays. They've been around for years. I think probably we'd all agree we struggle without them. So when they were first introduced, I think banks saw these as win-win, such as, from the massive potential savings in terms of not having to have as many branches, opening times of branches and staffing those branches. And the convenience to customers was really a big impact as well, the ability to be able to get money any time of day. However, what wasn't realised at the time was the impact to the banks from the loss of the relationship with the customer, and then the impact this has on customer loyalty. As in, people form attachments to people, and this is then going to have an influence on loyalty and churn rates and the potential of that customer leaving you. Secondly, I think that sometimes totally inappropriate transactions are used for self-service. So take the example of a very complex transaction. They're going to be more difficult to automate, and inherently they'll have more failure points throughout that transaction. So consider this carefully, as your overall success rates are likely to be lower with an impact on customer satisfaction as well. And sometimes the transactions just don't lend themselves to self-service, such as card fraud reporting or making an insurance claim, as they're just far too emotive to try and self-serve, in my opinion. Then I think the next point is businesses tend to underestimate the requirements on IT systems. So nearly always it's going to place additional requirements on the systems that you use within the business in terms of functionality. For example, do you need to provide a web service for an IVR system to integrate to provide information within that application? And the supporting infrastructure. Often this isn't understood or impacted properly, which then can lead to large problems for the contact center itself, or just inaccurate costs going into return on investment analysis and business cases. It's especially important when integrating with older legacy systems, because it tends to be more difficult integration with some legacy host-based systems. And then I think quite often the take-up rates of self-service channels are overestimated. Make sure that your self-service, if it's built on estimates that are unrealistic and never going to be achieved, that's going to have a far greater impact than just failing to achieve your return on investment. If you plan for staffing levels based upon a certain proportion of your customers taking up the self-service option, and that doesn't happen, even if it's out by a couple of percent, that can potentially cause a massive impact to service levels in the short to medium term in the contact center, which then you're going to have additional staff to address and the associated costs to train and recruit.
Okay, so it'd just be good to get your input again on this. So considering those four key common mistakes that Steve has gone through there, which of these would you think is the most likely to have I suppose, the biggest negative impact on your business? So out of purely financial considerations, inappropriate transactions, underestimating IT system requirements, and overestimating take-up rates. So which of these do you think could have the biggest negative impact on your business? Okay, thanks for that. So, Steve, do you think these answers fit in with your experience of self-service in general?
I think it's typical. It'd be very interesting to find out who said what answer, because we've got sort of 30 or so percent say that underestimating IT is, a massive part of it, and 30% are saying purely financial, and then it's split between the other two options. I'd be interested in seeing if the people who said IT system requirements worked in IT, because I think that's typically what happens. So it tends to be a sort of a view based upon your particular area. But it's certainly similar to what I've seen before. I mean, mostly people say purely financial considerations, I think. But I've never come across a business that wants to introduce primarily from another perspective, such as customer experience, for example.
Okay, cheers for that, Steve. And would you say, I suppose, of these common mistakes, that the purely financial considerations would be the main reason that, perhaps from a customer's perspective, that they'd think an organisation would want to self-serve?
Yeah. I mean, as I said, I've rarely seen it done from purely a customer experience, because it's very, very difficult to demonstrate that type of stuff in a business case. That's why it tends to always be focused on the financial considerations. But it would be good if more projects were also focused on the customer experience. And I think that leads quite well into, sort of the next step, which is, how can we avoid some of these pitfalls? So the process I like to use is sort of, first of all, sort of broken into three things, really. So planning, first of all. So when planning the transactions that you're going to self-serve, don't just look at documented business processes. You've got to examine it in live practice. Go and sit next to your agents taking the calls. One, that's going to ensure that your documented processes are accurate. And secondly, it helps you understand the time taken to complete with an agent. If you compare that to, the estimate of what it's going to take to self-serve, customers are definitely going to be doing this. And as a general rule, never try and self-serve something that it's going to take longer than it would do in the contact center. And remember that a customer will probably not see the time that they've saved waiting in a queue as a benefit, because that's your issue as a business anyway. And then think about the impact of self-serving to customer relationships, loyalty, and opportunity to market. The self-service transaction may work really, really well in practice, and sometimes too well. But so if a greater proportion of your customers end up using your self-service channel, that's an interaction opportunity you've lost. And this is going to differ from business to business, as to what the impact it's going to be. I mean, if you examine like online self-service tickets, you compare purchasing a train ticket online to a cinema ticket online. Although the transaction is very similar, train tickets tend to be a cornered market. So that's very different with a cinema ticket, because a customer has choice. So having loyalty is going to be critical still. So, many cinemas, for example, offer membership benefits now to counter this, where, they give you a discount if you use them as opposed to a competitor. And the opportunity to market point is key at the moment, as there's potential legislation that's going to impact businesses' ability to market to both their current customers and their future customers, going through the European Parliament.
And Steve, just in terms of, I suppose, putting this into practice, there's obviously a certain amount of testing that would need to be carried out. What should the approach towards testing be? Should people be looking towards things like focus groups to monitor this initially?
I think that if you've got the opportunity, it's certainly worth considering if you can, as any information that you get into the sort of planning process is going to be useful, but I think it's more useful in the tuning phase, which I'll cover a bit later really. So, next, transactions we've covered. So next I think it's critical to look at your systems. So, what systems is your self-service going to have to integrate with? Are there going to be any additional availability requirements? For example, most self-service is 24/7. Is the system that you're integrating with available 24/7? And is functionality and capacity required to support the self-service function? How are you going to do changes and planned outages to this system? Once you start serving 24/7, you have to start considering this type of stuff. And also from an IT perspective, do you need to be offering out-of-hours support for that application? Do you have a database that's required for self-service that's got a 4 to 5 hour overnight batch process that makes it unavailable or slow to respond? You might have to consider replication options, and remember also that if you've got an unreliable system already, if you try and use that for a self-service, you're going to end up with an unreliable self-service application. So then, people. Consider the people element. Involve all the right people across your business in planning. Process experts, technical, legal, compliance, security, marketing, and also, like we said before, consider involving your customers if you can. And when designing the flows of your self-service applications, never try to force a customer to use a self-service channel. Offer them choices, offer them, you can self-serve via a website, you can self-service via an IVR, offer within an IVR, for example, both DTMF and speech. And then do never try and hide your live agent channels, such as, making it difficult to find the number to actually contact you. That's going to have a really negative impact on your business. And then consider, including tutorials for self-service. Is this your first time utilizing a website? Walk a customer through the first time they've used something. And recap processes on an IVR. Say, I'm going to ask you for this information, so the customer's prepared with the right pieces of information for the call. And is there a benefit to be achieved in your take-up rates if you can offer other incentives to people to use self-service, such as, maybe prioritizing customers that attempt to use an IVR to self-serve that for some reason fail, maybe putting them towards the front of a queue when you pass them to an agent. And then planning your results and measurements. So you've got to ensure that your business case is built on sensible estimates for both your take-up and your completion rates. If you overestimate either, it can have a massive impact to the success of the whole project and the planned return on investment. Maybe plan for an incremental improvement over time to the levels that you need to get return on investment. And then think about what you're going to need to track and report on. Ensure you include this in your application requirements to your technical teams. It's going to be critical to be able to see why people aren't using your self-service channels for ongoing improvements. And also look to report outside of self-service, a particular self-service application, for additional insight. If someone fails in a payment IVR, are they then going to use your online website to pay instead? That information is quite useful. Okay, so the second part of this is to avoid pitfalls, the implementation phase. So you've decided on your self-service offerings and you've built your applications. Have a self-service launch. Remember to promote your self-service channels with customers and staff. Treat it like a marketing promotion launch day. So in emails, SMSs, letters to your customers, in-agent scripts, change your queue messages to let customers know that these channels are available. This promotion is going to be required ongoing also, bear that in mind. And then phase your rollout. Consider a phased introduction of self-service and expanding into other areas. So if you, for example, create a customer identification application with an IVR, for example, for pre-identifying and doing pre-DPA checks before passing a call to an agent, you get the benefit of saving call time when that call goes through to an agent, because the customer's already identified themselves and you can pass that information to the agent. But that element is going to be required for many other different parts of self-service, such as paying a bill, getting a balance. So if you do that first and roll that out first, you can tune that element, and that will then make your later self-service applications more successful. And then remember to train. So are you training your staff on the new self-service channels? If you don't engage with your teams and explain what the objectives of the self-service strategies are, it's not going to be as successful as if you can get them to champion the service. Then take-up rates are going to be greater. And train your agents to assist and help customers through these self-service applications. If a customer comes through to an agent and they've had a problem with self-serving on your website, maybe get the agent to talk the customer through completing that via the website while you speak to them. If you spend some extra time on calls now, think of all the repeat times that customer then potentially will use that self-service channel. And then sort of the final stage of avoiding the pitfalls is tracking and tuning. So you've got to examine your results and constantly improve. Examine why customers are failing to self-serve. Look at your dropout points throughout the transaction. And when looking to improve it, if appropriate, for example, consider the additional insight if you recorded the call within an IVR and then listening to that transaction. You can learn a lot as to find out why your applications might be failing and why customers are falling out of self-service IVRs by doing that. Consider conducting surveys to both successful users of self-service and unsuccessful users to find out why people like or dislike the self-service channels, and use that information to drive improvements and offer additional self-service channels. Then I think it's very important that you monitor real time. If you see a slow increase in failure rates at a certain stage of a self-service transaction, such as when a web service is called for particular information, that might indicate an outage is immediately imminent, and you can then take action to prevent a full system outage with your IT teams. You might want to consider reporting on these types of failures in the agent contact center as well. And then have a plan for failure. If the self-service route was to fail, you need to consider what the impact of this is going to be on the contact center, and have already in place plans of what you need to do to minimize the impact. Remember, the first indication is going to probably be in the contact center if a self-service channel is down. So ensure that the correct communication processes are in place to make the right departments aware. And then don't assume success. Even if the estimated take-up and success rates have been achieved, don't take this as face value, as you might not be able to sustain it, and take-up rates can fall over time, and it's important to continue to improve the service. Never assume that because a customer transaction via self-service is successful, it might not mean that the customer is necessarily happy with it, it's just that it was successful.
So Steve, on that, I know a lot of organisations out there conduct things like follow-up surveys if they've used perhaps a web chat channel, for example. But what considerations do they need to make with regards to, I suppose, getting the balance right, really, between making the most of measuring that result and that insight that you've got there, and also keeping the self-service channel convenient for the customer?
That's a good question. Well, I think that if your self-service options aren't convenient, then they won't be used. So the measurements that you should have in place will show this straight away. So it's really what you're going to do with that information that's going to make the difference. When a customer chooses not to use a self-service option or fails to complete, you've got to find out why and make the appropriate changes to improve it. Maybe ask these customers for their feedback. For example, if you do this very quickly after a failure, offering a solution to the customer to what they were actually trying to do or achieve, then that's more likely then to be seen as a positive experience. Even customers who don't fail out of an IVR to an agent, they may lose track of them. So you might want to then consider recalling these customers to find out, what the issue was and whether there's anything that you could do to assist them. Okay, so moving on to the last part of the presentation now. So I'm just going to continue my recent experience of self-service. So what happened on the day? So on the day we arrived as planned, and there was a queue for the machine and also the ticket counters where you collect your tickets. So one of the 3 ticket collection machines was actually out of service, so that was probably the cause of the queues. So I did have to queue up for 10 minutes, but that wasn't too much of a problem because I got there 30 minutes early, so we still should have had plenty of time. So I got to the front of the queue eventually and inserted my card. However, there was an error then saying there was a problem with the booking and I had to go to the ticket counter. Now, this would mean that I'd have to queue up again in the counter queue, which possibly was another 10-15 minutes, which then puts me a bit too close. Maybe I would possibly then I wouldn't have been able to get everyone sat together. Fortunately, I realised that I recently had been sent a new debit card, and I'd actually used that to put into the machine. However, registered on the website was my old card, so it was lucky I still had the old card in my wallet. So inserted that, got my tickets, we all went in and we all sat down and we watched the film together. However, my long-term goal was very nearly not met. So although the self-service website met all my expectations, easy to use, available, convenient, offered savings, it met my short-term goal, which was to book my tickets, but my long-term goal was to actually get to the cinema and get seated together as a group. You need to be considering the potential impacts of similar things in your businesses, really. So from a business perspective, if that company was to compare my online purchase to another, it's nearly impossible for them to tell my differing requirements to someone else. But if I hadn't have brought my second card, I would have had to potentially queue up again and then not been able to sit as a group, and that would have had a big impact to me and my son and my family for that particular day, as I'd have a group of disappointed kids and an unhappy son. So you need to try and cater for this in other processes around your self-service. Even though this really was my own fault, in future, if the same instance had come up again, I probably would have changed my behaviour, and the likelihood for me to use the same service set channel again for the same scenario would have changed. So consider how you can cater for this in other methods. So how could that experience have been improved? So maybe not having to re-queue. So maybe the company could introduce a person process to call a supervisor from the collection machine and then take me to the front of the queue to collect my tickets. Consider there's possibly some extra cost and time and effort involved for the business, but you've got to weigh that against the benefit in terms of customer experience and how many times is that likely to happen as well. Maybe the company should consider allowing people to reserve specific seating. Maybe just allow this on online bookings, on self-service. Then I wouldn't have actually had to arrive early, and I could have just arrived, got there a little bit later, got my tickets, but because I knew they were reserved, it's not an issue. You could then use that as an extra incentive for people to get to use the self-service channel, especially if that is only available, that option to book tickets, specific seats, is only available via the self-service route. and I'd probably have been willing to pay a premium. So are there additional financial, benefits for the business by self-serving? And then perhaps the application itself, the ticket machine, could have had a self-help function, sort of a simple message on screen just to say, this can happen if you've used a different card than what you've booked with. Then I could have dealt with the issue myself, which I did in this particular instance, but another person who the same issue occurred for might not have realized what the issue was. So, to finish off, some conclusions. So, self-service gives you the opportunity for many positive effects, but you've got to consider the customer expectations and their experience. You've got to plan effectively and choose the transactions for self-service very carefully. Offer choices, but don't force your customers to use your self-service channels. Monitor your self-service channels real time and continually strive to improve them. Thanks for your time. Any questions?
Yes, so Steve, what sort of specific examples of companies have perhaps you come across that you think that have implemented self-service particularly well?
Well, interesting question, because I'm quite interested in this. I have a lot of, what I tend to do is I have a lot of credit cards with no balance on them at all. What that lets me do is utilize those cards to try and use that particular business's self-service functions. So one of the cards I have is a Barclays one, and for Barclay card, their self-service IVR is really, really good in my opinion, because it's actually a good experience to use. It's an enjoyable experience. So one of the things that they do really well, for example, is they offer both DTMF and speech. So that lets me choose to talk to the application or use DTMF should I choose, and that's a really good example of being as flexible as you can with a self-service transaction. And as well, whenever I use it, I never have to ring the contact center afterwards. Anything I've done on it has always worked. It's actually achieved what I want. I've been able to get a balance, or I've been able to check a particular payment. It's never failed when I've tried to use it, and I use it 2 or 3 times a month.
Okay, brilliant. Cheers for that, Steve. I think we're probably just about up on time now at the moment, so thanks all for listening today. If you do have any further questions, either myself or Steve will be available to field any of those on either self-service in general, anything on the presentation today, or any further information regarding Noble Systems as well. You can get in touch with us directly using those contact details you see on the screen there. We'll also be making the webinar available. We recorded this so you can access that through our website over the next few days, which is www.noblesystems.com, so be able to get that and download it. Once again, thanks very much for joining us today.